Welcome to the Horror Vault channel. We bring you the most unbelievable stories that will leave you wide-eyed wanting more. Subscribe now and hit the like button to join in the fun. But remember, once you've signed up, there's no turning back.
You may be wondering why I've been looking so exhausted lately, as if I've had a long bout of insomnia. Why I start every time the kitchen cupboard door opens by itself. And why, despite being in my 30s, I have gray hairs on my temples. Well, listen to this scary story. You will probably burst out laughing in disbelief, just like many people I've tried to share my fear with. Until a few months ago, I would have liked to join you myself. Sitting in the well-lit kitchen one evening, a glass of cognac in my hand, I shyly and insincerely echoed the mocking laughter of my friends. Now I don't know whether to cry or laugh. Every morning when I look in the mirror, I see the growing number of gray hairs that have accumulated during the recent nightmare. For some time now, I've been afraid to sleep. Or rather, I'm afraid of waking up in the middle of the night, startled by the faint creaking of a door and a muffled voice calling my name from the dusty depths of a wardrobe. It all started about 2 years ago. We were on the verge of completing another major project. As usual, we missed the deadline and had to leave the office just before midnight. I was exhausted, so I only had enough energy to drink a bottle of beer and go to bed before the evening news was over. I never complained about sleep, especially at times like this. That night, I woke up suddenly. My eyes stayed closed, and for a while, I couldn't figure out what had woken me up. Then I felt that someone was in the room. I know what you're going to say. All the psychiatrists I've consulted have told me the same thing. Many people experienced similar sensations from time to time. They feel as if they can sense someone's intense gaze behind them, and so on. If it had all ended with that feeling, I would have gladly agreed with you. But then I heard footsteps. After standing near the wardrobe for a few seconds, this thing moved towards the kitchen. Its stride was not cautious. The stranger seemed to feel like the owner and made no effort to conceal its presence. I want to convey that the sounds were quite clear, but I didn't perceive them in the typical way that people do. I sensed the footsteps. I felt them as if the sounds bypassed my ears and directly entered my brain. Witnesses who described the experience of telepathic communication state that the voice of the person they were talking to echoed directly in their head. In the same way, I perceived the presence of this being. The footsteps seemed to be born in my brain, and at the same time I could clearly imagine the place from which they came. In the same way, I felt rather than heard the click of the switch in the kitchen. There was no fear at that moment. That came later, when the creature's visits became more persistent and regular. The first time, there were only a few faint knocks from the kitchen, as if someone had moved the dishes left on the table. Then the switch clicked again and the footsteps returned to the wardrobe. And then, there was a sound that would haunt my nightmares for the rest of my life. It was the soft squeak of a door opening in the silence of the night. I lay there for a few minutes, waiting for it to go on, but all was quiet. Finally, after reassuring myself that it was all a dream, I calmed down. In the morning, the incident seemed insignificant and ridiculous. I had practically forgotten it, and it was only 2 months later that I remembered it. I came home late from a party, a little tipsy, took off my clothes, and fell into bed. As you may have guessed, I woke up long before dawn, which was quite surprising in my condition. I could hear the faint murmur of water coming from the tap through the closed bathroom door. I didn't pay much attention at first. The alcohol was doing its job, pulling me into a dream filled with fragments of dreams. Sleep was about to embrace me again when I heard a soft splash, as if someone was washing their hands. I listened, holding my breath. The splash repeated, and then the murmur stopped. I could feel it turning on the tap, though of course I couldn't hear him. It was a strange feeling. Then the door opened. Damn it! I could have sworn on anything that I could make out a faint light through my tightly shut eyelids. A switch flicked, and at that moment, for the first time, fear rumbled in the back of my heart. I heard another sound. It was a very faint sound, at the limit of what I could hear, but it was unmistakable. The thing about the light switch by the bathroom was that every time it clicked, a broken spring rattled, and I could swear I'd heard the bloody spring rattling. It was only a few steps from the bathroom door to the entrance of the bedroom. And as the creature took those steps, it came to a halt on the threshold. I failed to mention earlier that the sound of the footsteps was quite unusual. It didn't resemble typical human footsteps. Instead, they had a slapping quality, as if the creature were wearing flippers, although the sound was not particularly loud, just a faint slap-slap. I am certain that a person walking barefoot would not produce such a sound. So, after stopping at the entrance to the bedroom, it stood there motionless for a while. I could almost feel its gaze fixed on me. Then, after a few lingering seconds, the creature continued its movement towards the wardrobe. The door creaked twice, something inside seemed to twist, and then there was silence. Thank God I was sober, otherwise I wouldn't have been able to sleep until morning. However, being drunk, I started snoring within seconds, completely unaware of my fear. After that incident, I finally got up the courage to tell my friends what had happened. I mentioned it in passing, half-jokingly, at a party. My friends just laughed at my scary story. Giving in to the mood of those around me, I laughed too, but the next night it was all repeated, and in a worse form. This time the monstrous creature went to the toilet. It sounds funny, but believe me, I was in no mood for amusement. First there was an incomprehensible muttering from the depths of the wardrobe. It was mostly indistinct, but it gave the impression of a terrible prayer in an incomprehensible, surreal language. The squeak of the door sent a shiver down my spine and gave me goosebumps. And again the soft slap-slap sound. The bathroom door opened and closed. After a few seconds of silence, without the sound of running water or the squeak of the toilet seat, the creature walked into the kitchen. It stood there, again in complete silence, and then returned to the bedroom. As on its previous visit, it hesitated at the threshold, but suddenly it approached the sofa and stopped right next to me. My heart was beating so loudly I thought it could hear it. But I pretended to be asleep and tried my best to breathe evenly and deeply. There was no sound of the creature breathing, only a kind of noise. A faint hiss and crackle, like a gramophone on the last track of a record. And the smell. The whole room was filled with it. It smelled like a damp corner of an old barn. Decay and mold and something else more subtle, but just as disgusting. I was lying on my right side, when suddenly I felt a terrible sensation as it crawled over me and settled into the empty space. It moved and shifted, like a cat finding a comfortable position, and then became still. Now we were lying just a few centimeters apart. I struggled to pretend to be asleep, and I could feel the creature staring at me relentlessly. Its gaze was cold and meaningless, with fish-like eyes, as if it knew I wasn't asleep and was trying to catch me off guard. The panic attack prevented me from even opening my eyes a little, but I managed to fall asleep very quickly. Since then, the monster has never returned to the wardrobe. Instead, it emerges and wanders around the apartment for a while, sighing and mumbling in its own incomprehensible language before settling down in an empty room. It stares at me, and I know it will keep watching until I fall asleep. Strangely, I am able to fall asleep quite quickly in such circumstances. Sometimes the other half of the sofa is occupied. You know what I mean. On those nights, the creature doesn't show up. Sometimes I'm ready to pick up a dirty, drunken beggar off the street and drag her into bed, just to avoid hearing that creaking sound. And I'm afraid to fold the sofa, even though I don't know what will happen. It will probably stomp around me, sigh, and go back into the wardrobe. But what if it doesn't? You're probably wondering why I can't lock the wardrobe. Oh, believe me, I've tried. The door has a simple lock that can be secured with a small key. One night I did just that, but it didn't give me any peace of mind. Instead, I had this unsettling feeling that things had only got worse. Something inside me said, it's better to open it. Unfortunately, I didn't listen to reason and clenched the key in my fist, as if it were some kind of protective talisman, and fell asleep. I awoke only a few seconds before the monster tried to get out. Still in a drowsy state, I heard it push the door. Then again and again. Immediately after that came a series of thumps from the wardrobe. Any remnants of sleep were instantly shaken from me. Clutching the key tightly in my sweaty palm, I waited anxiously for what would come next. The door was banged several more times, with increasing insistence. It wasn't a knocking, begging to be let in. The blows were heavy and less frequent, as if someone were ramming it with their shoulder, trying to break through the weak barrier. Just when it felt like the next blow would knock the door off its hinges, it suddenly stopped. I thought it had calmed down, when suddenly a terrible scream came from the wardrobe. It was a half cry, half roar of despair, a nightmarish plea mixed with rage. It was a wild, boundless rage. At that moment, I was on the verge of letting out a scream and rushing out onto the landing, breaking through the front door. Only the sheer terror that gripped my body like a tight knot held me back. I didn't even have the strength to throw off the blanket. Gritting my teeth and squeezing my eyes shut until my head throbbed, I waited for it to burst out of its flimsy prison and pounce on me. If a single sound had come from the wardrobe, I would have either wet myself or stuttered for the rest of my life. Maybe both at the same time. But it was gone. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. I lay there until dawn, clutching in my right hand the talisman that had almost been my undoing. As soon as the room was bright enough, I stumbled into the kitchen and poured myself a full glass of whiskey, which I downed in one gulp. Then, on shaky legs, I made my way to the wardrobe. The key turned in the lock with a click, like the release of a trigger. Astonished at my own audacity, or rather madness, I opened the door. Inside, of course, there was nothing. Nothing frightening or strange. A couple of suits on hangers, an old leather jacket, a couple of small boxes containing various odds and ends, and a burned-out iron. And on the back of the door was a piece of fabric that crumbled to dust at the slightest touch. I spent the next few nights with friends, lying about some planned repairs. But I couldn't rely on the hospitality of others indefinitely. So, expecting the worst, I finally returned. The very first night I got home after trying to lock the wardrobe, the creepy creature touched me. It began, as always, by lingering near the sofa, hovering over me and emitting a low growl. Sometimes I thought I heard familiar sounds in its growl. Occasionally, its muttering becomes more intelligible, and then it seems as if it's trying to say my name. It crawled over me, bulky and heavy, and sat on my chest. At first it lay motionless, then it stretched something cold and long towards me, like a snake. Through the thin blanket it tickled my hand, as if a multitude of large beetles were crawling on it. And then it touched my face. The touch was unbelievably disgusting. It wasn't like someone touching your nose or your cheek or your lips. It was touching my whole face at once, all at once. It felt like dozens of slippery little eyelashes, or like cold, wet snow falling on my face. It's hard to explain why I didn't get rid of the wardrobe. I don't know. I can't. For some reason, the thought of it frightens me more than the nightly visits. At least nothing terrible has happened yet. Not yet. You won't believe this, but I'm really scared. Me, a person who has crossed 2 hot zones and made over 30 parachute jumps. Me, who fell through the ice a few years ago and only survived thanks to a calm mind. I'm scared. I'm afraid every night when I go to bed. I'm afraid of my fear. I'm afraid that this time, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I won't be able to stand the overwhelming feeling of terror, and I'll open my eyes.